wanted to see what we can do to avoid that in this case. But over time, as we've been out and about, and others have, looking at how we can achieve this transition in a just and fair way, we realised it needs to be broader. It needs to be a framework that connects climate action with social justice, economic inclusion, gender equality, and poverty reduction. In Scotland, the idea of a just transition has been taken seriously and embedded into national policy thinking. And at the Just Transition Commission, we described this transition as both a process and an outcome. It's a means of getting to net zero as an outcome as well as an outcome in itself, by tackling inequality and delivering fairness. And what we mean by that is that climate action shouldn't happen at the expense of workers, communities, or particular regions. Instead, we should think about how we can create new opportunities and distribute the benefits more equally. And there are several core principles that shape Scotland's approach. These include supporting good, secure jobs as the economy changes, sharing the costs and benefits of the transition fairly, involving workers and communities in decision making, investing in skills and regional development, and using climate action as an opportunity to address existing inequalities rather than deepen them. And at the very least, ensure that we do no harm internationally. This is not about us achieving it in Scotland by offshoring our emissions. This is about looking how we can do it in a way that makes it easier and more equitable across the globe. So it's not just about cutting emissions, it's about reshaping the economy in ways that improve people's lives. And we've seen how globally that concept has gained traction. The Paris Agreement recognises the importance of ensuring transition support, decent work and the workforce, and discussions at COP increasingly emphasise that climate action must be inclusive, participatory and fair. However, as many of you working in international development know, there's often a gap between recognising justice in principle and delivering it in practice. A major shift is now underway in the international policy landscape that aims to close this gap. Recent UN climate decisions are beginning to frame just transition not only as a climate concept, but also as a development agenda. And these discussions recognise that transitions are multisectoral and multidimensional, and they must be grounded in sustainable development and poverty eradication rather than a narrow technical issue within climate policy. And when I joined the Just Transition Commission, just as an aside, I sat there wondering why I'd been invited there. My background is social justice. My background is campaigning against poverty and racism. And I was sat there with all these people with huge levels of technical expertise in the areas of renewables, energy production, investment finance, etc. But as we travelled around the country, it quickly became apparent that unless we begin to connect with people and communities, we're not going to make this transition as quickly as we need to and as fairly as we need to. So this move to low carbon economies isn't just simply an energy transition. It can transform labour markets. Well, it will transform labour markets. It will transform food systems. We're beginning to see some of that already. It will transform infrastructure, land use, and we would like to see it transform positively social protection systems that should be sitting alongside all this, because it connects mitigation, adaptation, and responses to loss and damage into a single lived experience of change for communities. When we visited communities around Scotland, they weren't experiencing things in neat silos. They weren't going to have the energy transition and then the transport transition and then the land transition. These things are all happening at the same time in communities. And it's that complexity we need to be addressing nationally and internationally. And that's why it's good to see in the international conversation that increasingly they're recognising there's no one size fits all pathway. Just transitions must be nationally defined and locally shaped, reflecting different levels of development, institutional capacity, economic structures and social realities. And I think that's a really important point for development practice. because as we know, justice is delivered through institutions, systems, and relationships that translate principles into everyday outcomes. And that's really where the hard work is in this transition. Because decarbonisation, as I said, isn't just an environmental project, it's a profound economic transformation. Entire sectors are changing, jobs are disappearing, new ones are being created, regions once dependent on fossil fuels are being asked to reimagine their futures. And for many countries in the global south, this transition raises urgent questions about livelihoods and economic stability and poverty. And if we don't do this fairly, we will be deepening inequality internationally as well as nationally. So that's why the just transition is increasingly seen as central to international development, because it connects climate policy to employment, social protection, equality, and economic justice. It asks not just how we reduce emissions, but also who benefits from the transition, who bears the costs, and who gets to shape the future. Recent international discussions have strengthened this perspective by recognising just transitions are about more than the labour market. They encompass human rights, gender equality, social protection, energy access, and the right to development. And within all that, access to clean and affordable energy is particularly important. And we see that in the conversations we're having with partners across the globe who are beginning to look at how they can implement a just transition. And what we're seeing within that is the importance of social infrastructure in enabling those transitions. And when we talk about that, when we talk about infrastructure, think about physical infrastructure, energy grids, transport networks, or industrial investment. But equally important are education systems, healthcare, social care, housing, public transport, childcare, and social protection, because they all shape whether people are able to adapt to economic change and whether communities will have the levels of resilience we know we're going to need for some of the climate shocks that are going to be coming our way. They influence whether workers can retrain, whether women can train, whether families can relocate, whether communities can withstand economic disruption. So we argue that social infrastructure is also resilience infrastructure and shouldn't be seen as something that's nice to have, but absolutely critical to be able to, for us to be able to make this transition. Because we've seen globally, we've seen in this country, without strong social foundations, transitions can become destabilizing. Workers unable to access jobs or training, families struggling to cope with income shocks, communities may feel that change is being imposed rather than being shaped with them. But when that infrastructure, that social infrastructure is so strong, it can make transition fairer and also more resilient. Right, I'm going to speed up. I've got 1 minute, I've been told. I'm only halfway through. Give me 3 and I'll finish. Okay, so basically, so what I'm trying to say is those strong social foundations are key to us making this in a successful way. But to fully understand why Scotland's just transition matters internationally, we need to take a look at it through an anti-colonial perspective. An anti-colonial lens encourages us to examine the deeper historical structures behind climate change and development. Who built wealth? Wealth through fossil fuels? Who benefited from industrialisation? And who is now experiencing the most severe impacts of climate change? Spoiler, it's not those who built the wealth or benefited from it. Countries in the global north, including the UK, produce the majority of historical emissions. Meanwhile, many countries in the global south are experiencing the most severe climate impacts, despite contributing far less to the problem. So from this perspective, a just transition isn't just about it being fair in Scotland, it's also about fairness between countries. So it raises deeper questions about global economic systems that have historically relied on extraction of resources, labour and land. And this is where Scotland enters the conversation. We're often seen as a climate leader with strong rhetoric around justice, participation and fairness. But fossil fuels have helped shape our wealth. North Sea oil in particular connects Scotland directly to global energy markets and to extractive systems that have powered economic development in the global north. So when Scotland talks about just transition, it's not only a domestic conversation about jobs and energy, it needs to be part of a global conversation about responsibility and leadership. And if we can demonstrate it's possible to move away from fossil fuels whilst protecting workers and communities, that sends a really important message internationally. Like, one more minute, promise. It strengthens the argument that wealthy countries should lead in decarbonisation and supporting the transition elsewhere. But if the transition increases inequality or leaves communities behind, it sends another message that justice is negotiable, whereas justice should be a non-negotiable in this. And what we've also seen globally is that women are more disproportionately affected by climate change. They're more likely to be in insecure work, carry a greater share of unpaid care responsibilities, and often excluded from decision making. And there's been a lot of work done by the International Labour Organization and by groups like Scottish Women's Budget Group to look at a feminist approach to just transition, which challenges us to think about how economic restructuring can either reinforce or address these inequalities. Final point, I promise. International NGOs, like many of you, then add another layer to this conversation. Many of you have raised concerns that the green transition reproduces old patterns of extraction if we're not careful. And we're beginning to see some of that in the exploitation we're seeing happen in some of the other countries. Because actually our levels of consumption and energy are high, and we're not willing to give things up. And that's a conversation we need to be having in Scotland as part of this, because we need to transform systems, not just change energy sources. We need to look at the structural barriers in the global south on delivering fair transitions. And quite often it's not a lack of commitment, it's a lack of means. So what's the responsibility we have to those means in terms of access to climate finance? So the emerging international mechanisms to support the just transition are critical. And the involvement of people working on the ground with communities in those mechanisms is beyond important as far as I'm concerned. Otherwise, we'll build a system that works for the few as opposed to for the many. And finally, I just want to add by saying that fairness is ultimately going to be judged at that community level, the communities you work in. And so without deliberate design, we could be reinforcing regional disadvantage, insecure work, fuel poverty. So a just transition isn't about replacing jobs, but supporting the wider social and economic fabric that allows communities to adapt, and investment needs to follow those principles. So all of this reinforces to me a really important point, that our transition is the same story as development practice and the international transitions that need to take place, because it raises questions about consumption and responsibility, and our challenges us to align what we do at home with what we advocate for globally. That's why the idea of a just transition is so important for international development, because it's not about technical solutions, it's about structural change. It connects climate action with labour rights, gender equality and global justice, and it challenges us to rethink what development means. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Satwa. That absolutely lays the agenda for our panel. So I'm going to kindly invite the panelists to come and join us on the stage. And while we're doing that, to remind people that you can start putting a question in Slido now. If you've got something burning specifically for Satwa, that's also perfectly fine. So please do that. Yeah, you might like to. Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry for the microphone fiddling. Okay, I'm very delighted to introduce our panelists, who are going to follow on very much, I think, from what Satwa kindly set out there about the transition being about justice and a process and multi-dimensional, because we really have a multi-dimensional approach here, I think. First of all, we're going to hear from Anthony Dane, who's co-founding director of Southern Transitions, which is a climate and transition think tank working to advance just transitions in the global south. So he'll tell us something about what that looks like. Then we're going to have Alex Gordon from Women's Environment and Development Organization, which is a global women's advocacy organization working for climate and environmental justice. And for those of us, maybe one or two of us in the room who are part of the women gender constituency for the COP process, we do have led the world and transformed the action of how all those processes, as Satwat was saying, approach gender justice. And I'm very pleased to be joined once again, thank you, by Professor Francesco Sindico, Professor of International Environmental Law from Strathclyde University, who will give us some of that perspective from a legal point of view. So first of all, I'm going to ask Anthony to speak for 5 minutes. Sorry, like that thing. You talk them over.
Yeah, I can see. I don't know if this is working.
It did, because I think.
Like, I can talk about it then.
Sorted.
Okay.
Other people.
Oh,
Just want to.
it's at the bottom. Hello.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm going to present some perspectives based on the work that I've been doing and involved in, which comes from South Africa, comes from an African context. I support the African group of negotiators within the UNFCCC negotiating the Just Transition Work Program. So these are some perspectives that speak to Africa, knowing Africa is not a country, but I think to some degree this is reflective. So we're a think and do tank focused particularly on advancing just transitions in the global south and in particular trying to unlock economic opportunities associated with the transition. So when we think of just transitions, it's not only about transitioning out, it's also transitioning in. It's about opportunities, and for Africa, that's the bigger interest in this discussion. My involvement, so some of the work that I was involved in is in this Just Energy Transition Partnership. So going back to Glasgow COP26, the partners agreeing to support South Africa in its just energy transition. But I think what's relevant here is to see that some of those sectors, it's not only energy, it's also new energy vehicles, which is about opportunities in that changing value chain. Also about green hydrogen, again, opportunities in the value chain, and starting to speak to what it is of interest to South Africa, but this speaks in some ways to the broader African context. But then also getting involved not only in the policy space, but also trying to get involved in implementation. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of talk shops, a lot about trying to make this happen. But the frustration on our side was saying, look, we need to translate this into something that benefits communities and people on the ground. So I got involved in trying to look at what could we grow, build, make, and sell in the context of the coal mining region in South Africa. And so this is Pumi, who's an ex-coal miner who transitioned to being a worker in an underground hydroponics farm. So we were growing strawberries, saffron, spinach, all sorts of things, trying to see what we could do that was different to coal mining. And part of the challenge is that you're trying to find some viable alternative, but you're now having to compete in global value chains. Mm-hmm. And so the business case for anything other than coal or fossil fuels is very difficult. And that's one of the key things to recognize is making it happen. Being able to compete in new and growing value chains is extremely difficult and is influenced by international systems of finance and trade and global value chains. So the ability of an African community to be able to transition out or to take advantage of opportunities depends on the international systems. That's what was talking about. So just briefly, I mean, this idea of a broader definition of just transitions, moving away from the narrow focus on the energy sector only and on particularly workers directly affected in the transition out, that's absolutely relevant and part of a just transition. But from a developing country perspective, the bigger question is around the transition in. It's that whole of economy, whole of society approach to just transitions. And I remember a conversation with an academic, Professor Yuba Sikona from Mali, saying to me, for Africa, it can't be a transition from high carbon poverty to low carbon poverty. And it speaks to what matters. It's about, that bottom one, system transformation. It's about equitable access to the transition's opportunities. And the broader view of just transitions is necessary to making that happen. So just two areas to sort of flag as we go into the discussion. The one is, thinking about international cooperation for just transitions. Really, the point Sapwat was making around inequality, that came through very strongly in last year's G20. Where do we stand now? That's off the table in terms of the US's G20 presidency. There is some hope in the UNFCCC and the Just Transition Mechanism. But it's a difficult time for multilateralism. But in order to address those international barriers and opportunities to transition to unlock equitable access in the developing world, we need international cooperation. We need to engage at that scale. So how do we do that given the geopolitics of the moment? That's part of what we need to engage.
Right, okay, I'm going to fiddle with microphones, I apologise. So very happy to hand over to Alex, but I think we're in danger of hearing the scale of the problems and the challenges, but let's go for it.
Yeah, so absolutely. I was thinking about us happening, and I appreciate your comments. I think you're going to hear a lot of us saying quite similar things, but maybe different approaches to how we're handling it within this moment and given our personal relationships with the spaces that we're in. So as was introduced, my name's Alex. I use both they and she pronouns, and I'm the manager of policy and development with the Women's Environment and Development Organization. We work mainly across advocacy spaces within the UNFCCC. I personally follow the adaptation negotiations, but I'm very closely linked with Just Transition, as was mentioned, as they're all connected. WEDO itself kind of really showcases that we know how multilateral systems operate, which rooms matter, who shapes decisions, and how negotiations unfold, and what it takes to influence them. And I think something that's really important to the way that we work, I mean, as you can hear, I come from a global north context, and we're based in New York City, but we have a very global team. Our impact strategy is really grounded in three ways. We're shifting power by expanding who participates in global governance. We're shifting money by resourcing gender-just climate solutions, and those are the solutions that we resource that are working at the front lines across the global south in particular, as well as advocating for financing systems rooted in justice. So we're very engaged in the multilateral climate financing spaces, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and other spaces. We shift minds by transforming the narratives, data, and assumptions that shape environmental and climate policy. And we really do this by building strong coalitions. And so that's really the perspective I'm coming from as the feminist climate justice world. We're not working within silos, but we're working together, and we're ensuring that we're bringing those that are, whether you decide that they are determined to be most marginalized or they've just faced the most inequalities, is maybe the way that I would like to think about it, should be presented in these global spaces in particular. I also want to make a note that when I'm thinking and I'm speaking on behalf of a feminist organization, I'm explicitly working from the basis that gender doesn't shape vulnerabilities, but inequalities and systemic power imbalances and structural inequities shape vulnerabilities. And I think that's something that we're still working on within the global space in particular, and within the UNFCCC in particular, when we're talking about gender equality. Women are sure more vulnerable to it, but it's because of those inequalities and not necessarily just because of their gender identity. At WEDO, when it comes to achieving a truly just transition, we're thinking more beyond the sector swap and the energy source swaps. A feminist approach to just transition requires us to first understand that capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and racism are interconnected systems that of oppression that mutually reinforce one another. An interplay of these systems has contributed to gender injustices, perpetuated inequalities and poverty, and justified, really, the exploitation, extraction, and concentration of natural wealth, as been mentioned in the hands of a few, contributing to the climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and multiple other poly crises as we are currently facing them. This understanding of the root causes in their systems therefore require us to take a structural approach to the climate crisis and related injustices, and to transform existing economic models, as I mentioned, as we have some examples that have been shared, from ones built on extraction, not just of fossil fuels, but of labor and time, particularly that of women, to ones built on care. And so that really requires a shift of power away from billionaires, super wealthy, global north communities, to countries and women and girls and gender diverse peoples, particularly within the global south. Or if we're thinking in a domestic case with a global north perspective, fully recognizing and integrating the intricacies of class, migrant status, race, and gender identity when building and implementing decisions around the transition from fossil fuels. Feminist ideology and principles have long concerned themselves with questions of power and structural change, as I've said, and are well equipped to bring this desperately needed analysis to those transition conversations. At WeDo in particular, we work to ensure just transition frameworks move beyond definitions of jobs and decarbonization to address care, energy access, and the economic systems that shape inequality. Our work advances care as a foundation of climate and environmental resilience, integrating energy justice into global debates, and supports partners to translate economic and climate research into those coordinated coalition advocacy spaces. And speaking from this time of uncertainty, mistrust, deep financial crisis of multilateral systems, I do think it's essential to not abandon these spaces, as been said. I appreciate that we're all on the same page there. And decisions, as they are often how local communities and frontline activists are able to hold their national systems accountable. A reference to civil society engagement and or ensuring free, prior, and informed consent or ethic is indeed a human rights principle, are just the beginnings to why these global spaces are really important and essential to sustainably integrating those national policies. So those decisions, those conversations that are happening at the global level are often some of the only times when frontline activists can then go to their national governments and say, you said this here, why aren't you implementing it here? And we can help you get there. This also means supporting the work of non-state actors, including which might have been seen as non-traditional in former development systems and development worlds. In a just transition space, that means like care workers and feminist groups, those that might not be seen as working in those more traditional sectors. This support, I'm saying more broadly, it really can range from financial resourcing to moving from only consulting with global institutions to actually providing those implementation contracts to local and community-led solutions. In the global space in particular, WeDo provides coordination and policy support, as was mentioned, to the women and gender constituency, and in particular, the Just Transition Working Group. And I just want to flag that Bellum Action Mechanism, or Just Transition, or as it's more called, and I'm sure you've seen that in the news, our colleagues in particular were really, really instrumental in ensuring that feminist principles were seen throughout. And it was the first time within a climate document that included care and informal workers. And that is massive because once it's in there, then we have precedent to make sure it shows up in other spaces. So thanks so much.
Can you hear me like this? Trying this one. Just trying microphones for your benefit. Okay. Yeah, no, great. I'm glad you're all quite positive about multilateral processes. I saw that there's already a question out there in the chat, in the Slido about that. And maybe Francisco can help us see where international law comes into this and whether there's anything positive in that space or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me again. I was with many of you already, I think it was September, and things have moved quite quickly over the last weeks, months. Even just in the past few weeks, several world leaders have shared their opinion on the state of the global rules order, which is just another way of framing what one can call international law. Canadian Prime Minister Carney in January said it is not in transition, but what we are witnessing is a rupture of the global rules order. Just yesterday, the European Commission leader van der Leyen said the EU has to be realistic and take stock that the global rules order has changed. These were her words to a group of ambassadors. We will always defend and uphold the rules-based system that we helped build with our allies, but There's always a but. We can no longer rely on it as the only way to defend our interests or assume its rules will shelter us from the complex threats we face. US and Israel commentators defending their war on Iran said, what has international law done for the thousands of people killed by the Iran regime? What has international law done to prevent the 7th of October? So the point that is coming out is that it seems from many that the global rules order is not working, it cannot be fixed, and that we have to abandon it. So let's ask ourselves, what has international law done for climate change? And if you look at the state of the planet, you could argue, just like these people said, well, not much, let's just abandon it. Well, I say that there are at least three things that international law has done for climate change. First, through the Paris Agreement, international law has provided a rules-based framework that shapes how not only states, but also private actors operating within a state are to operate. Are we moving fast enough? Obviously not. Do you not like the Paris Agreement? Then show me something else that can realistically replace it and cater for a global wicked problem like climate change. Second, international law has provided clarity on the possible illegality of expansion of fossil fuel related activities. Last year, the highest judicial body of the UN, the International Court of Justice, released an advisory opinion on what states have to do to protect the climate system and what happens to them if they don't. Very long, boring legal stuff, but if you want to read one paragraph, read paragraph 427, where it literally says something that the COP process has never been able to say, that if you have high-level capacity, high-level technology, global north, but not only, you still want to expand your oil, coal, and gas, you may be acting unlawfully. Third, and this is where it may end up mattering the most, international law has inspired communities in the global south and north to seek climate justice in domestic courts. Despite the lack of enforcement of international law, at least in the sense we're used to in domestic law, whether you're in Malawi or Scotland, international law, including the paragraph I just mentioned, is starting to filter down to national courts. That's where you and me, sometimes with NGOs, sometimes alone, can actually go to our own judiciary and seek justice. Over the past year, a plethora of cases have happened in Germany, Switzerland, the UK, the USA, amongst others. Indonesian farmers have sued a Swiss cement giant for its contribution to climate change and the damages it has had on their livelihoods in Indonesia. Filipino survivors of a deadly typhoon are suing Shell in London. Pakistani civil society are doing the same against RWE in Germany. And just last week, Client Earth in the USA has started suing one of the biggest pension funds of the country because of the climate change risk faced by its members through its investment portfolio. It's another way of strategizing for climate justice and hence also a just transition. I now finish by saying that to those, and there are many, probably not in this room to be honest, but to those who argue that international global rules order is dead, I say long live the international global rules order. It is not perfect. What is? But what is the alternative? The alternative is a world in which powerful countries can decide on a monitor, who to attack and annex. This is taking us back to a world of maps and kings where war and force was the law. That's how things were, not that much time ago. The international global rules order, imperfect as it may be, was the civilized way out of the rule of the jungle. Climate change is an existential global problem. It cannot be solved by one actor, one state alone. And boring as it may be, I'm going to finish exactly like the two of you It requires cooperation, and cooperation requires order, a global rules order, and that is international law. Thank you.
Which I think answers a question that somebody's already put online about whether there's something still to work for. Thank you. Before we open up to the floor, and thank you for the people who put questions already, please do carry on. I wondered if Satwat wanted to respond in any way to any of the comments that were made there.
Thank you. In short, there's nothing that's been said that I would disagree with whatsoever. But in terms of reflections, it sort of reinforces that this is a sort of multi-sectoral, multiplayer transition that we need to try to make real for people. And I think one of the things that people find hard to do, and we've certainly seen it, not so much people on the ground, but those who make the policies, etc., is to think of what the alternative is and what the alternative could look like. So I think we do need to spend some time almost working with communities to say, okay, then, what does it look like if it isn't this? And it always reminds me, and I'm paraphrasing here, of the quote that people find it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. You know? Because it's so embedded in everything. It's really hard to think about how do we extricate ourselves from the exploitative economic system that we have. And where we've seen examples of it happening is locally. You know, the local action that we've seen across Scotland, the local action that requires that international law framework, that requires us to be challenging national actors, states, private institutions, and which we see people on the ground beginning to do. What I've also recognised is that when talking to crofters in Shetland, many of the issues they were talking about is the same as I've heard people from a grassroots organisation in Patagonia talk about. It's different geographies and it's different contexts, but actually there is, I think, power in us trying to develop a network which looks at action that's worked and supports people to be able to take some, I suppose, comfort in that there is possibility, because otherwise these wicked problems seem too big to address. But on that local level, I mean, in the northeast of Scotland, there's a Northeast of Scotland Climate Action Network. They've got a Just Transition Communities project where you've seen people being involved in looking at street by street retrofit, you know, by the community for the community, where they've campaigned unsuccessfully, sadly, to keep a local green space open, but the harbour expansion took priority, sadly. But they've also recognised it's important to bring communities together. And so as part of their Just Transition Communities project, there's a Women of Colour organisation that's been set up. So they're looking at those who are marginalised within the actions they're taking locally and trying to bring them to the centre. So I think coalitions, collaborations, keeping the lived experience and activism at the centre of how we address those structural inequalities and how we recognise that this is structural change we need, as you said. Communities aren't vulnerable because there's something intrinsically vulnerable about them. It's about the systems that create vulnerability. And, you know, I think at a time when international law is under attack, we need to be protecting it and campaigning for it even stronger, because you can see why the actors who are attacking it are doing so. They want to be able to act without being challenged. And so we need to protect what we've got, but build on it. But looking, you know, those very local examples, if you go on the Just Transition Commission website, we've actually got an interactive map of where just transitions are happening in Scotland. Very community level. But some also with renewables companies and others beginning to look at how they create different models. And it's, you know, internationally, yes, we're going to be looking at, we at the Just Transition Commission are working with others to set up an international network of Just Transition Commission-like bodies. We're having our first meeting on the 24th of March. We're co-chairing it with Australia. Early morning here, late at night there when we have it. But one of the things that's come up quite strongly for that is, can we look at practical things we can do and learn from each other? Because ultimately it's about moving from the principles to the practice that's going to change things. And I think what we've seen here and heard here is how you work with women and other groups who are historically disadvantaged by the structures, how we use the law, and how we make sure that the industries coming in and the jobs coming in aren't on the same extractive model as those that we're trying to push out. So there would be some of it, but that was brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
We have a couple of practical questions, and then I'm going to see if anybody would like to ask their own question. But one was to Anthony about what you are actually doing in South Africa. So maybe you could paraphrase that a little bit. And one was a technical question which got quite a lot of upvotes, which was, has anybody been measuring the impact on the climate of what's happening in Gaza? And actually, we could probably extend that into what's now happening on Iran and the Middle East. I don't know if anybody's able to comment on that, or maybe somebody in the room is, if you are. But maybe, Anthony, you could answer the question, what's really happening in South Africa first. Thank you.
Yeah. So a few different things, and then I'll focus in. I think probably part of the question stems from that photo of the underground mine. I can give the underground farm. I can give an update on that. But some of the work that we do is policy level, so the think tank type of work, and then the do tank is trying to translate policy signals into action. So that happens in different ways. So part of it is working with the South African governments in issues related to the JET-P. There are challenges in implementing that. Part of it is that South Africa was quite early in bringing that, opportunistic to some degree, in bringing that to Glasgow, and wasn't adequately prepared. And so part of the challenge is that South Africa wasn't perhaps empowered enough to enter into that partnership, to enter into those deals, in ways that would benefit South Africa. So some of the conditions are not supportive of what makes sense for South Africa, and some of the fault sits with South Africa. Because part of it is actually a transition out of fossil fuels, which has been slow and has been a challenge. So in many ways, it's very stuck. We're trying to work out how we can get it unstuck. Whether we can pull on additional international cooperation levers to try and move it forward. There are other sources of support from the climate investment funds around green industrialization, industrial decarbonization. But part of the challenge is that what you're needing to enable that transition out is green industrialization. And a lot of the kind of climate funds that are available, that type of support is not within the scope. So you can get support for, and it's inadequate, of course, for mitigation, for adaptation, and now for loss and damage. But green industrialization, that's part of the challenge, because that's about competitiveness. So that's where countries are trying to, countries don't want to forego that. So we're also working on that in the context of critical minerals. So in Africa, so Africa has the African Green Minerals Strategy, and now moving that towards implementation, how to translate those policy signals into action. We were involved with the G20, with the Critical Minerals Framework. Again, similarly, how do we translate that into action? So a lot of work at the moment is translating those policy signals into action. Critical minerals are where one of the bigger opportunities lie for Africa, because Africa has a lot of critical minerals, so it has more leverage, has more power. And how to convert that into more favorable deals is the challenge. More partnerships of more equal exchange, ultimately, is, and capturing additional value from those minerals. In South Africa, with that particular project, the story is a very unfortunate one. That coal mine closed, and we weren't able to find viable options. So Mpumi in the picture there lost his job. And that's, for me, the experience involved in that is a desperate one. So we're trying to implement on the ground, but again, the challenge is finding viable opportunities to decarbonize or to transition out. And And so it's not a positive story, unfortunately, but I think there are lots of lessons, and certainly we're still trying to find ways in which we can connect different incentives to try and draw on levers of international cooperation to try and unlock, business cases and investment cases to make those pathways viable.
We have a lot of very big questions online. Like, Francisco defended international law, but he said it wasn't perfect. How could we change it to do better? I think you need to write your next book, probably on that one. So but if you want to reflect and come back to it, I'd like to open up, maybe if you'd like to take the microphone. Thank you. I was wondering if Ben Wilson would like to ask his question in person. He's right at the back there. Thank you.
Remember what that is?
Can you answer the Gaza question? All right, sorry, yes, go on. Hey, go on.
Between the two.
We'll answer the Gaza
We
question.
give the floor to Ben just on the Gaza situation. If the question is, can we measure the impact from a climate change perspective, meaning from the greenhouse gas emissions that were embedded in the attack on Gaza? I don't know. I don't know whether anybody has made those calculations. Probably somebody good at maths and statistics can probably give a rough estimate. The one thing to say is that in international law and the Cooperation on Climate Change, emissions from the military are not counted in the international cooperation, whether you like it or not. That's just a security thing. For a country like Panama, maybe not such a big issue. For a country like the United Kingdom, that is a big issue. That is a big slice of the cake. Iran, you'll probably have seen 2 days ago, the oil deposits or oil fields have been bombed. That has created a massive environmental problem over Tehran, but also because it goes in the air and the air is stupid, it goes into other countries, Now, back in 1990, the Iraqi government did the same thing as a defense and bombed its own oil wells. International law went ballistic. We had 20 years of court cases in The Hague because of environmental destruction. That's the asymmetry in power, if you want.
Maybe I can share that there is a book that tracked, it's called Environmental Warfare in Gaza. I cannot remember the author off the top of my head, but it was 2023 only. So that's, a short period of time. And then Oil Change International has also put out a publication tracking oil reserves and how that has funded the genocide in Gaza. So there is some work being done, there's some maths being done, but I think the scale of it is probably quite difficult. And then the calls for tracking military emissions is something that the Women and Gender constituency has been doing for a long time within the UNFCCC, but it is slow going.
Thank you. Maybe that's an answer to the question to Francisco, is that we need those kind of things to be added into the international law framework. Ben, would you like?
Sure. That's interesting. Push a button. Underneath the switch. Underneath. Oh. Okay, great. Thanks very much. So my name's Ben Wilson. I work for SCIAF, and one of my jobs for SCIAF is to follow the COP process. And my question on the Slido was, we obviously need two key things to achieve a global just transition, real priority things at the moment. Huge amount more of climate finance and also the political will to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. And my question is really, what would your advice be to us as a sector, and where we should put our energies over the next few years to help try to achieve both of those things? But if I may just ask a sort of second part to that, which is about international law and fragmentation. So I'm a bit nervous. As you'll be aware, there's a huge effort towards a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. There's a big event, first of its kind, happening in Colombia in April. And to me, that's maybe reflects a fragmentation of the global order, and I'm a bit worried that might undermine the COP process. So I guess there's two parts to that question. Do you think we should really be putting our energy into the fossil fuel? Talking too long. Should we put our energy in there, the COP, both? Great. Thanks.
Well done, Ben.
Hey, Alex, you got the right.
Yeah, I can start with where to put the energies is a difficult one. I think when it comes to the just transition conversation, I'm not sure if there's an either or it's rather a both and. And I'm obviously speaking from the advocacy perspective in particular. And I think we're at a moment with this mechanism development where it's giving us an opportunity for the countries that have maybe started at the national level with these commissions to then bring to the global stage what's worked and what hasn't worked. But then that next piece of financing also has to happen in conjunction, or then the conversations are just a talk shop and it doesn't matter. When it comes to I'll make one comment on the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty moment. We will have a presence there, one individual from our organization, and that is because it's been done, I think, in a way of complementary to the UNFCCC process. So it's rather not trying to separate it and not create something new, but to provide a space for a small set of government officials and very specific non-state actors to gather together to have a conversation outside of what was a very contentious political conversation around moving away from fossil fuels at this past COP in particular. I think it's very important that it's being co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands. I think that was really strategic, and I think that's also how it's maybe going to be a quite useful space for this.
Yeah, just I think going back to the question around sort of finance and where to focus and the COP, you know, sitting from a negotiator perspective, there's no doubt that civil society played a very significant role in terms of getting the mechanism to land in the decision, both in terms of actually helping to, you know, help present what it could look like, inspire imagination, and then to also be a weight. I mean, add to the arguments. You know, the G77 in China was saying, you know, all of these developing countries are asking for this. We need more, and civil society is asking for it as well. And that was significant. So that's a particular, I guess, mechanism, you know, for civil society. I think the challenge with the mechanism itself is, you know, from a climate finance perspective, trying to get a new fund, extremely difficult. But even the funds that exist, trying to take some of that and put it into just transitions, also extremely difficult. We're seeing recapitalization of the GCF and various other instituted bodies within the UNFCCC, cuts of 30+%, and it wasn't enough in the first place. So I think we do need to think about how to influence capital outside of those spaces. And how to ensure that you know, private sector capital, NPBs, where do we have teeth to influence those investment decision makers to integrate and mainstream just transitions into what they do? I think that's quite a big gap. I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Wants to comment on the?
I'll just comment on this and then come on to you. I wanted to say that one of the big messages in our final report to the Scottish Government was that people need to be seeing action and they need to start seeing things making a tangible difference and improvements in their lives. Otherwise, we're going to lose the social license for this. And part of that is about capacity and the state's role in supporting communities with capacity. So when we were in Dumfries and Galloway, we spoke to individuals who are spending all their evenings after they put their kids to bed trying to go through enormously long legal documents and all sorts for meetings they have the next day with very large forestry organisations. So we've spoken about the inequality that there is there and about how one of the things we've suggested is for every public pound that goes to a private company, we have just transition conditionalities built into the contracting of that. And we've given them a whole toolkit on how to do it. So let's now wait and see what happens. But this was partly because when we were dealing with private companies, they were saying, if you give us guidance, we'll do the bare minimum. If you compel us, we'll do more. And we need to be compelling people more now in making sure the finance is going into these places and not into profit. And so really, And the political will, I think, is something we need to be pushing hard on in Scotland and the UK, as well as internationally. Those political headwinds coming from the far right are affecting us here in Scotland as well, are affecting our communities and will impact on how governments respond. And we need to be pushing governments to hold hard and fast on tackling inequality and poverty nationally and internationally. Otherwise, we'll see that race to the bottom that we're beginning to see happen elsewhere. So I think the political will is important, but I think it's up to the people to make sure that we keep the pressure on for that will.
You could also reflect on this. Another question about how will AI influence it? Will it hinder or help some of this activity? Probably to add to your
Just throw everything to me. So Ben, if the question is, if you're in this sector and you only have a limited capacity and you need to choose, obviously one would not want to choose and go everywhere and do everything well. But the reality is at some point you will have to choose where to send your one person, let's say.
Yeah.
My sense is that the phase out fossil fuels is the big thing to look at. But what I would urge myself and everybody is to do two things. One is to move from a room like this, which is a great room, but I do feel there's a bit of an echo chamber, slightly all on the same page here, and move to other chambers, board of directors of companies, governments that we may not like too much, and so forth and so forth. Now, how you enter those rooms, I have no clue. Or I do, but in my own world, let's say. But it is really important. But go into those rooms with the necessary skills, which includes both your discipline, but obviously in my case, if you are considering litigation strategy, then also look at what has happened elsewhere and so forth. Colombia, yes or no? I think especially if you're a least developed country or a small island developing states, you don't have much of an option. You want to do everything there is. And as much as we, to some extent, defended the Paris Agreement, it is understandable why some countries, in particular small island developing states, are very skeptical about the Paris Agreement and are looking at alternatives. But I don't think, even very nicely collaborating with some of them, none of them in serious think this will replace Paris. It is a complementary effort. Oh, yeah.
You can
Was
reflect.
that from you or for everybody?
No, you can reflect on that if you like in a minute. I can come back to it. No.
I mean, I was lucky enough, well, or not, to be at my university in a workshop on AI and sustainability. And I put my hands up as I have no idea about AI, something about sustainability. But what came out there again, and maybe it seems that I'm always going along the legal and regulatory side, is that leave aside the technology. Actually, what you need is regulatory and social guardrails against or in favor of AI. So one thing is the impacts of AI on sustainability, the water footprint, the energy footprint, but actually, most likely, not me, once you actually understand what the hell AI is, you can actually harness it, and it potentially, hopefully, can be helpful for sustainability.
Thank you. Lewis has had the most upvoted question, so okay. I'm gonna throw the microphone to Lewis then.
You stand up and really project.
Okay.
Give that a shot. Hi, yeah, Lewis from Water Witness. My question on Slido was about the kind of value and importance of water for the transition and its access and use. And given the kind of increased focus on water globally, both with UN Water taking place later this year, also the water focus at the high-level political forum in New York in September, but also Africa's 2063 vision, their water policy, which is published earlier this month. An additional angle that came out here in the UK was the National Security Assessment by DEFRA that came out just a few weeks ago that looked at biodiversity loss and the kind of increased importance that water access and use will have in hotspots around the world that will impact our national security. So the question is using water as the lens, is there a way to depoliticize and also play on the enlightened self-interest aspect that the national security report might lead some political angles to come to a space to work together on climate issues using water as the starting point. Do the panel think that's a useful lens at this particular juncture for near-term action? Thanks.
Francisco, you've got the mic.
Very quickly, so the UN Water Conference, the one that will take place in Abu Dhabi 2026, follows the New York 2023 one and so forth. I am not convinced that water/security will be a big topic there. I agree with you that it could provide a lens, but the extent to which it will, I'm not 100% sure. A lot of things are uncontested. Water is useful for adaptation, water for ecosystem services, and whatever. It's also slightly uncontested, I would say, that this idea that we'll all fight for water wars and so forth was overly stated in the media and so forth, and that actually in many conflict areas, even in the Middle East until very recently, water actually brought people together rather than apart. How to bring that into a context of international law, international cooperation, which is in rupture or whatever you want to use it, that is a big question. I'm afraid I don't have a clear-cut answer to it.
I'm going to contest something that you said on behalf of someone shaking their head over there who deals with Sudan. I think it's not quite clear that water isn't a source of conflict.
Also for the Kurds in Turkey and northern Iraq.
Okay, but we can maybe have that discussion.
And it increases pressure. That yes.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer, but a couple of reflections, and I'm not a water expert, but I think at the heart of the COPs and UNFCCC, it's less about mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage. I think it's we're dealing with the biggest global reallocation of capital that we've ever seen, and there's value at risk, and there's value to be captured. And that's where a lot of the focus goes. And I think water is sort of slightly less relevant within that economic story. However, I would agree with some of the comments that are being made. I mean, I think there's value in putting more of a lens on water. I mean, in particular, there will be transitions that are related to water, and we need to learn and bring these questions, these justice considerations into those transitions, absolutely, and that applies to nature transitions, to AI transitions. Anything that can exacerbate inequality is problematic, and AI, is really at risk of that. But also, just in the just transition space, what developing countries were trying to do is to bring adaptation into the scope a bit more. So, when you have climate action that can negatively impact others and reduce their ability to implement their own just transitions, similar things can happen with adaptation. You can end up damming up water somewhere, and then that impacts the ability of those downstream it undermines their resilience. So I think what we haven't seen enough of is that kind of international dimension, the cross-border storylines linked to water. And I think the lesson from the just transition work at this international cooperation space is that cross-border story and kind of international dimensions of water need to be thought about more.
I'm just going to make one quick point, and that's one of the things that I have seen though with water is access to it being threatened between nations. I mean, I'm thinking about India and Pakistan, for example, and who controls what river. And I think that's something that's going to become more and more the issue that we need to be alive to as we're going through this transition. And so I think we need to, I mean, one of the things we've said in all our reports to Scotland, but it's equally applicable elsewhere, is we need to get ahead of issues and not constantly react to them. So if we're beginning to see that there might be flashpoints around water globally or even nationally, then we need to be planning for that and what we're going to do with that. Otherwise, it is going to become another one of the areas that's going to be contested.
Go on, Alex, and then I'll get another question. Thank you.
Just very quickly, I also think that it's yet to be seen how we'll continue to kind of challenge the disconnect of the Rio conventions in particular and the CBD conversations that are also upcoming that will definitely bring us as well. I do want to bring a thought, maybe a challenging thought, into if we're thinking of depoliticizing something, but then connecting it to security, if that's the way we should be thinking about it, where, you know, as beings, we're all political, so we should not depoliticize water in particular.
Yeah, thank you. There's a very practical question here, anonymously posed, which is, if one person might like to answer it, which is, should renewable energy providers be required to pay into funds like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund or Shetland's Amenities Trust? So basically, should we be getting the renewable lot to put money into these funds as well as the polluters? I guess is the tenet of the question.
My short answer would be yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay, everybody agrees. Whoever asked the question, we all agree, thank you. I'm gonna ask kind of one closing question about Francesca, who is the next upvoted one. I don't know if she's here somewhere. Would you like to ask your question in person? No, okay.
I don't have one.
Fine, it doesn't,
Not me.
no, okay, fine, so this would be quite nice to have an alternative voice. Okay, thank you. Her question was, how can we move on from tokenism in women in this space, essentially?
How long do you have? No. I think maybe short answer is thinking around things of gender justice and rather than the binary, I think is a start. I think by leaning into the women and girls narrative, then you are obviously going to be tokenizing women and girls then. But if we're thinking about gender justice and then equality across gender identity, where it can challenge that to begin with. And then I do also think that there is the narrative sometimes in a lot of climate negotiation spaces that if we just have women at the table, then things will be different. That's not the case. There is a need to instead kind of shift power in particular, and that means if we're bringing more diverse voices to a conversation or to a negotiation space, that we're not just having them there as faces, but rather they have the capacity to actually engage. So that is building, whether that's, you know, building up their ability to engage in those negotiation spaces, which WeDo does do that. We do a bit of training for women negotiators from Global South countries in particular, but then also then restructuring who is in charge of some of those spaces and conversations. And so I think a narrative that sometimes happens in the negotiation space to get a little bit policy wonk, maybe gritty, is that there's always chairs, that one from the Global South, one from the Global North. But you can often see maybe there are those who have spent a little bit more time in those spaces and are taking over those negotiation processes. And we can maybe be challenging that a little bit and ensuring that those co-chairs are indeed co-chairs. And then in particular, when you're thinking about putting together a panel and you're putting faces and voices on that you're ensuring that you have not just diverse in terms of face, but then also in perspective, political beings and things. But happy to have that longer conversation separately as well.
Okay, thank you. If you can manage it, if you could give us 30 seconds on where you might have a realistic perspective of change, just so we can leave the room feeling manage it. We literally have 2 minutes.
Okay. I think we need to recognize that there is an opportunity in this moment, you know, and there are these shifts that are taking place, and we need to try and identify opportunities for partnerships of mutual benefit. And so, for example, South Africa, Africa, and Scotland and the UK. I think there are real opportunities for mutual benefits that would be in line with the just transition.
Okay, that's good. Mutual partnership. Go on.
Sorry, something quite dry and boring for me. But I think if we can get the metrics of this right in terms of actually what it means to have a just transition and look at the monitoring and evaluation frameworks, that's a real opportunity. Because if we can begin to show the impacts, positive impacts of what we're doing through having that framework, then I think people will begin to take some of this a bit more seriously.
Thank you. Measure the positive impacts. Excellent.
I'll go a different direction and say that we should be building and the capacity by resourcing those that are on the ground in frontline communities doing the actual just transition work right now that have no global or even national recognition within their spaces.
That's excellent for many people in the room who are trying to do that. Thank you.
In Scotland, in relation to a just transition, focus on the co-benefits, whether it's housing, whether it's agriculture, whatever it is, because there are many. And once you start working on them, you will start seeing them. At an international level, focus your efforts as a development community in supporting corporate climate change litigation. So litigation from civil society in transnational context, providing that evidence that you see on the ground and how those impacts from fossil fuel corporations are impacting the lives of people.
We might need your help to make those things join up, but thank you. Excellent. Please join me in thanking the panel. And we're going to have a coffee break now, you'll be glad to know. So if I could ask you to come back at 11:15, that would be grand. And thank you to those online who are joining us. Please take your own coffee. Thank you. Yes. It's good. I'm going to try again. I'll repeat. I'm going to keep looking up saying thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Then say nothing interesting. Don't worry, I don't want to. You have to let me No, I need someone who knows how to whistle, actually. I'm sure there are some football fans somewhere. But okay. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you for keeping to time. Much appreciated. We're going to try and build on some of that brilliant expertise that we heard in the first panel about how everything's multidimensional and look at some of the practical challenges that are faced by those really on the front line of climate change. Essentially, in some way, the world's food producers in their totality. It's not a little bit unfair of me, but without them, clearly we wouldn't be here at all. And actually, they're doing an awful lot to preserve future biodiversity already, and we're going to hear a little bit about that. So on this panel, I'm very pleased to welcome Clive Mitchell, who's Head of Terrestrial Science at NatureScot, whose tagline, for those that don't know what NatureScot's tagline is our plan, nature thrives, people flourish. We've had some great slogans today, so I think that's another one to add into it. Sitting next to Clive is Stephen Mwangi from the International Institute for Environment and Development, who's going to speak about smallholders everywhere, kind of. And we have Casey Rayner, who's the founder and director of A Future Worth Living In, a pioneering organisation dedicated to guiding financial institutions in understanding and implementing sustainability practices as they invest in the transition. So we've heard a bit earlier about the importance of investing in the transition. And I'm very happy to say, hopefully, he's not here. Okay, we are hoping that Gertrude Siami from Zambia will be able to join us online. She is Programme Specialist for the Livelihoods and Climate Change Adaptation Programme at Caritas Zambia. Okay, the plan is that Clive speaks and then Gertrude, but if she doesn't manage to join us, we will adapt, because that's what we're all here to do. So over to you, Clive. Thank you.
Francis, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. So, although we as NatureScot, we're primarily in Scotland, my headspace for this is very much around the interconnected, interdependent themes of climate, nature, food, water, and health. And I wanted to say a few words about... it's not working. It's about now. Okay, that better? I wanted to say a few words about underlying causes, and much of what I'll say will reinforce what you've already heard, but from a different perspective, I hope. I wanted to say something about underlying causes, both in terms of people and planet. And underlying causes can be quite difficult to get at, but I think they're even more difficult to get at if we don't speak about them. And oftentimes we don't speak about them as much as we should do. So from a planetary point of view, one of the things that concerns conservationists is this notion of shifting baselines, the idea that each generation has an experience of nature and the natural world that they've developed over their lifespan. And over time, that becomes less and less, as it were, as nature gets more and more degraded through various activities associated with economic activity, for example, predominantly. And so this kind of notion of what good looks like, what normal looks like in natural systems is quite slippery and hard to pin down. So, and we often, as conservationists, agonize over whether the 1970s should be our baseline, the 1940s, the 1850s, pre-industrial, post-glacial, or even Pleistocene megafauna and that sort of thing. But for me, the only sensible place to start is with the evolution of the leaf. And I want to do a little thought experiment with you. So I want you to imagine a world without leaves. I'm going to help you a bit because this is about 380 million years ago, and I see some of you in the room might not be old enough to remember what that was like. So thinking about how water would have flowed across landscapes before leaves, it would have been very rapidly from source to sea, mainly in braided river systems and not doing anything very interesting at all. And because of that, all the kind of biogeochemical, biological, geological, chemical processes that sort of regulate Earth happened really, really slowly before that time. And that's why we get things like snowball Earths in the sort of 700 or not billion years ago and so on. And then with leaves, we get soils and then meandering water systems through muds and marshes with lots of staging posts between source and sea. And with that, we get a modern hydrological cycle, we get modern biogeochemical cycles, and the Earth gets a really effective thermostat through which it can regulate temperature over time. And all of that stays really true until about 200 years, plus or minus a lot of years, when we started to drain the land predominantly and find as many ways to gain the water off the land and into the sea as quickly as possible, really kind of starting to disrupt that sort of carbon cycle and water cycle. And in the last 50, 70 years or more, with an increasing pollutant load into the oceans as well and through our river systems. And all of that then magnified by the burning of fossil fuels has completely disrupted our global carbon cycle. And that is the climate change problem that we have in essence. That is the kind of root underlying cause of what we're trying to kind of tackle here. And in most of the way that we've used land over the last 50 to 70 years in particular is to maximize productivity and yield for profit in that kind of post-war consensus. And that's been, significantly driven by fossil fuels, particularly through fertilizers. And most of our kind of modern food systems are based on fossil fuel in the oil economy. And so it's very much tied up with the whole kind of climate change and equalities kind of conversations that we've been hearing about today. One way to improve productivity and yield is to remove all the competition, sometimes called nature, from those landscapes. And that creates very brittle landscapes full of monocrops for various things, from in Scotland, from cereal crops to Sitka spruce plantations, and even to the management of the uplands for grouse moors and stuff like that. So, and all of that is kind of predicated on the stable and predictable climate that we've enjoyed for the last 10,000 years, plus or minus. But that's not true anymore. We live in not only a warming climate, but a more stochastic one as well, with extreme events and unusual patterns of weather. And if climate change was only about averages, it would be kind of tricky, but not that difficult. It's the stochastic aspects of climate change that are more and more kind of problematic. And so we need to make sure we manage land, especially through soils and water, to make our systems more resilient to climate risks in particular. And thinking about some of the remarks about environmental justice from earlier and so on, the 7 generations perspective of 7 generations past into the present and into the future is a really good way of thinking about stewardship of the land over time. I've been given a time warning, so I need to kind of speed up a bit. But in terms of people, I wanted to flag the IPBES is to biodiversity what IPCC is to climate change. And about 18 months ago, they produced a report on transformative change. And I need to preface these remarks by noting that the UK government, along with 150 others, signed up to every word of the summary for policymakers in speaking about the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, which are to do with dominance over people and nature, and disconnect between people and nature, concentrations of power and wealth, and prioritizing short-term individual and material gain. Really quite challenging stuff. If you haven't read it, it's very much worthwhile and underpins pretty much everything that we've been talking about this morning. In Scotland, what can we do about that? We can act local and think global. That's not very original, but it's a really worthwhile kind of mindset to have in mind. And the final thing I wanted to say is that a lot of the underlying themes of what we've been talking about this morning so far seem to me to be about the politics of control versus the politics of caring. And we might want to come back to that in the conversation.
All right. I think we're all going to dream of leaves and a world without leaves tonight. I'm pleased that I think Gertrude is
audio only.
Audio only. All right, that's a challenge. Okay. Gertrude, if you can hear me, unfortunately we can't see you, but if you would like to say something about what you're doing and what the perspective is from Zambia, that would be grand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. Hope I'm being heard.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Gertrude Siame. I work for Caritas Zambia as a program specialist heading the Livelihoods and Climate Change program. And what we are doing in Zambia, we are basically advocating for just transition, mainly focusing on agroecology. And we have also been working with community members, facilitating the engagements between community members and the members of parliament. In this regard, community members have really shaped up their own decision regarding the effects of climate change on how best they can respond to them. And one of the most prominent things is that they've engaged with parliamentarians to demand for the recognition of agroecology in the policies, and also to ensure that they revisit the package for FISIP. The government of Zambia has been promoting the FISIP package, which is basically only composing of chemical fertilizers and also the hybrid seeds. But they've put up recommendations and decided that they need to engage with the government, which they've been doing through the parliamentarians, so that government can come up with some packages that are organically made. In this regard, they've been asking for having organic fertilizer. Apart from that, also ensuring that they recognize the mixed seed or grain that they have as farmers, so that it can be accepted by FRA, the Food Reserve Agent, and ensure that they provide market just like any other seed grain that they're buying from the farmers. And because government has mainly been focusing on buying only the hybrid seed, and for in this regard, they've gone further to also demand that they need to consider the indigenous seed as seed and not to be calling it grain, because they believe it is the same seed that has contributed to the food systems of the country for the past years before the hybrid seeds were on the market. And also farmers feel the open pollinated seed varieties gives them the opportunity and independence to multiply their own seed and be able to replant it. And also in terms of the climate acceleration, small-scale farmers have actually demanded that for now, agroecology it is an alternative to food transformation systems in Zambia. It has proven to be very effective. And also, apart from that, it is cheaper and products to use are readily available. And it has respect for tradition and culture as opposed to prescribed kind of food systems that the country is having right now. Coming to the opportunities that are there in the region, for now, we have a lot of opportunities because we are having the same interest in the region, trying to transition from the mechanization kind of farming or conventional farming to agroecology. And also there are a lot of opportunities in the region because currently we are holding a lot of agroecology conferences, which draw participants from different countries in the region where we are learning from one another. And also the growing interest in the international communities and organizations, including the parliamentarians, in supporting agroecology. We see this having good fertile grounds for us to go ahead and transition into organic farming, hence also having much influence on the policy change in the country, so that we can recognize agroecology as an alternative way to our food systems in the country. Currently, we have economic trends off, where the government is moving towards mechanization and conventional farming, which entails that establishment of farm blocks, cutting down a lot of trees, paving way for these huge farms. And also, not only are they cutting down trees as a way of contributing negatively to the environment, but you find that small-scale farmers in the rural areas are being displaced. And the question is, where they're being relocated, are they going to have the same piece of land in terms of the hectareages that they've had? So this, we see it to be contributing negatively to the food security of the country, hence causing a lot of food insecurity in the country. Currently, also, extension services in the country are tailored towards chemical fertilizers because the extension workers that we have are mainly focusing on what the multinationals are telling them, because they're funding them in terms of fuels, transport, and also allowances. And therefore, as Caritas Zambia, we've tried to respond to these challenges by ensuring that we promote savings at community level, and community members, these are the community farmers, have actually worked well with the savings and accessing money at a low collateral, because banks are actually providing very high interest rates. And we are lucky that in the country, some of the banks are providing the climate financing, but it is very, very difficult, cumbersome to access this funding. The process is not user-friendly. Going forward, we are saying agroecology is the way to go because it is context-specific and it respects cultural tradition, also improves on food security, restores the soils that are depleting. It is also cheaper. We did research with SCIF, and we've seen that agroecology works, and it is the only alternative that we can go to for in order for us to have an effective food system transformation in our country or in our region.
Thank you,
With-
Gertrude.
Thank you.
That's perfect, because Stephen's currently, I'm going to it's wonderfully placed, because Stephen's going to tell us a little bit more about all those smallholders and saving systems and how that works and what IID have been doing to support it. Thank you. And we'll come back to your questions, Gertrude, so don't go away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really want to pick up from where Gertrude stopped. As it's been said, I work for IID. It's a very interesting space that we are in today because IID was started about 54 years ago. And it was started by Barbara Ward, who was speaking at the intersect of economic development and environmental sustainability. So you can visit our website to see much of that. I don't know how to bring those slides up.
Sorry.
But I can speak. I think I can just speak from my space. Yes.
Fiddle with that.
Thank you. Yeah, you can fiddle with that and then I can talk. Thank you so much. So one of the questions that was asked here by Gertrude is about the issues of finance. Perfect. So so we are working at IID, we are working with smallholder farmers through their organization, so organized groups. And we are working in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and also in Africa. Next slide, please. And we have what we call the FFF approach, the Forest and Farm Facility approach. We work through strengthening members. We've heard from the previous speakers about the political headwinds, and we think that there is strength in numbers. So we try to organize these farmers. We work with already organized farmers, those who are producing some interesting things on the ground. And then there is always the issues of individualism. How do they bring them? How do they aggregate to get to move things? Then we have up to the global level where we are now also advocating at the COPs and those other important forums, bringing the voice of the people on the ground to the discussion table where the rooms they might not have access. Next slide, please. So, but we think that it's important that when these people are also speaking, their capacity to organize and to be self-governed is really strengthened. And one of the issues that Gertrude has just spoken about is about finance, for example. We found that on the ground, these people are not getting the money that they require. There is a lot of global commitments. I think the UK last time they committed 500 million, if I'm not wrong. The GF, the big programs, they are talking of the people on the ground getting empowered, local action. But when you follow the money really, it's just mind-boggling that partly 1% is getting to the ground. Where is all this money going? And what is their excuse for not trusting these people who are being impacted by climate, who are the custodian of those lands? And for your information, for example, the biggest shareholders in our lands in food production is the smallholders. 84% approximately last time I checked of the farms, 510 million hectares is controlled by the smallholders. But you don't want to trust them with the money to just transition, but you're eating those foods produced by those people. It's a big question and we need to think about it. So that's a toolkit that we developed on helping their governance to improve. Stephen Mwangi and Duncan McQueen authored that. Next slide, please. And just previously walk back at least for that slide, please. So I met that group of people in Ghana, somewhere in Ashanti region, and you can see those are people organized and keeping a little bit of money in small safe boxes. The banks and these climate financiers, they are saying that these people cannot be trusted. I found it very, very, very opposite of what was being talked about, that the transaction costs are high, that these people cannot be trusted to repay back the money. But when I talked to those group of people, they were within themselves getting money through what they call village and saving associations. And the repayment rates are mind-boggling, over 99%, because it's based on trust. And those people can do small things to develop. Next slide, please. So when we did a study in 2018, my colleague did that. We found that farmers were actually investing a lot of money in climate issues, almost 368 billion of their own money. And compared to what the commitments are being done at the global level, it's mind-boggling. Next slide, please. So yes, these people can feel it, the climate. If you've looked at the IPCC reports, they are the most vulnerable people, especially those that are depending on nature. Next. And they are doing like what Gertrude said, they are investing in nature, in agrobiodiversity. So our work is to collect those evidences, to co-generate evidences and policy that informs policy and practice. Thank you. I have a few seconds to say that in our program in FFF, we've had 68 million USD delivered to us, and almost 70% of that has gone to the farmers. So we trust farmers. We believe that they are agents of change. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for everything you do. And thank you, Casey, for being the slide monitor on that one. And maybe you could reflect a little bit on why investors don't trust farmers. Thank you.
So there was a comment earlier about going into different rooms, and today I am in a different room. I'm not normally in this room. And there's only one pinstripe suit, and that's you, Francis. Obviously, there's a lot more pinstripe suits for me, and normally there's a lot more men. But there's like more than 3 women, which is great to see. So I work with institutional investors. I've worked in finance and investment my career. Institutional investors, if you don't know what they are, they're like Scottish Widows or Phoenix Group or Standard Life. They're who you have your pension with. They have loads of money, probably because around the world, lots of us are saving for retirement, and in lots of countries, we've been forced to put money into a pension. And so when we see the WEF reports looking at who owns companies, and we think it's the elite, it's actually people like us who have a pension. Almost half the money in the global financial system is pension money. One of the challenges that we have is that money is being invested in a way that is destroying the kind of future that we want to retire into, because we've forgotten what the purpose of money is. The purpose of money is not to make more money. The purpose of money is to serve society in fulfilling its dreams of flourishing, but we've forgotten that. And we've forgotten that we created the system in which we currently operate. Like you said, most people can imagine a catastrophe easier than they can imagine the end of capitalism. But we are seeing already the end of the kind of multinational global order, rightly or wrongly. Donald Trump blowing things up, putting in place tariffs, and exposing the brittleness of the current economic and financial system is helping us understand that big things can change, sometimes for very bad reasons. So global financial reform was on your agenda of things to talk about. I don't think I'll get there in my few minutes, but what I did want to touch on, again, because it was mentioned earlier and on the topic of just transition, I did some work with Nick Robbins, who's based out of the London School of Economics and sits on the Just Transition Commission in Scotland. And he was mobilizing investors to help finance a just transition. And I sat on that group. And one of my friends from a long time ago, I went to school in Western Australia. We were talking about work-related stuff, as you do, and I was talking about the just transition. And she was in the business chamber in Australia, and she said, "Oh, we're doing something. We're doing something like that. Come and have a look." So I went over to Australia to look at the transition that was taking place in Collie. Collie is a very small coal mining town. It has 10,000 people. To put that in context, that's the same size as Wester Hailes. It is responsible for 70% of the state's emissions and around 40% of Australia's emissions. Huge amount of emissions, right? It's all in the report if you want to read it on the website, Future Worth Living In. So I went over there to look at what did investors do to make this happen. Turns out nothing. It wasn't investors at all. It turns out that having a state that has a huge political majority in a Labour government who still aligns themselves with unions, who taxes the extractive industries that operate within their state and then redeploys those taxes to build a better future, are able to put in place a just transition. So political power and money play a huge part. And what we saw was there were 4 key factors for why this transition was successful. And as was spoken about earlier by Satwat, yes, place is important, but place as a function of people and community to help inform the vision and identity of what that place wants to be in the future. Asking people what they want, turns out that's a good idea. Then setting appropriate targets and timelines along with the de minimis around what you will accept. So, for example, no company will close without giving 3 years notice. Would have been nice to have that kind of thing at Grangemouth. And then the final thing, coordination and delivery. Turns out if you put someone in charge of just transition and make it so they get fired if it doesn't happen, things start to happen. Also, if you put responsibility within the cabinet, reporting directly to the head of the state and telling them they have to deliver just transition through all of the portfolios rather than as a standalone thing, that also helps deliver, because a just transition is not a thing in its own. It is both an outcome and a process. It needs to be done through your industrial policy, through your economic policy, through your skills policy. So quite a lot of this is detailed in the report. And as Satwat said, there is now a convening because we're all facing the same problem. So I don't understand why civil servants all have to do their homework separately. Please club together, cheat, use the examples from other countries that have worked well and employ them in your own country. So the convening of Australia and Scotland working together will be great. And hopefully the head of the Collie delivery unit was from Pittenweem. And I was surprised when I arrived to interview her. So the one thing I wanted to share with you that if you take it away has relevance is the circle diagram on the right-hand side, your right-hand side. This is the vision statement for Collie. Again, 10,000 people, a vision of what they want for their communities. They weren't worried about climate change. They were worried about their children's future and losing their jobs. It was really personal. And it's the same in the northeast of Scotland or anywhere else we talk about it. I think the big thing to take home is that it was power with rather than power over, and reimagining a future whilst respecting the legacy. This was a coal mining town with a train through the centre of town transporting coal. And they were being demonised by people who think coal shouldn't be burned. And they were like, we powered this state And we will continue to power this state in the future. Time's up. Oh dear. Okay, last thing, honestly, things are happening in Scotland too. The Green Finance Institute has partnered with Transition Finance Scotland. We're looking at mobilising capital from those big institutional investors into the transition and moving from transactions to transitions and building up capacity and capability to be able to do that at a global scale. There's lots of examples on the website. Have a look. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for keeping to time. We do put some questions in Slido, although I have to go and find my tablet somewhere. I promised to look. But meanwhile, I wondered if we might ask the panel for some thoughts on some of the trade-offs, because we've talked about this as a positive, one-way street, but actually the reality is that probably in making some of these decisions, even for your smallholder farmers, that there's some trade-off that might have to be made. I don't know if you have any examples, or maybe Clive, you could reflect on what others are doing.
Okay, I'll make a start. Yeah, well, I think there are trade-offs and there are false trade-offs. And many of the trade-offs that we get presented with are false ones that largely depend on where the boundary is drawn around the problem. Then this links back to some of the earlier remarks made around environmental justice. So the issues of recognition, what's on the table for discussion, lead to procedural justice, who gets a seat around the table in making a decision and in whose interest is that decision made. Which then determines largely the distribution of costs and benefits and risks and opportunity arising from that decision. And so depending on where the boundary is drawn around that problem will lead to where those trade-offs lie, as it were. And so from my point of view, in terms of the role of nature and farming, and particularly sort of more regenerative agroforestry types of farming that have been discussed already, that is in a more chaotic climate, that seems to me to be a great insurance against some of the risks associated with extreme weather and unusual patterns of weather. If you try and farm in a kind of monocropping system, you need to get onto the land at certain times of the year to do certain things, to pull a crop off later that year or the next year or whenever. And if all of that goes wrong because of the wrong type of weather at the wrong type of year, then you're stuffed. And if that happens at a big scale, well, who's going to pay when it all goes wrong? Usually it's the taxpayer. Is that fair? So agroforestry and regenerative practices, which generally involve a more diverse range of crop within and across years, allow farmers to hedge bets and effectively diversify their business and to remain viable within the more chaotic climate that we're moving into. So I think, again, I guess that comes back to underlying causes in terms of, what's driving the choice, and are we dealing with the symptoms of a problem, or are we able to sort of tackle some of those underlying causes that we've been talking about?
Thank you. I've looked at farmers, and one of the things that comes to mind is that the farmer, whether he's gone to school or not, he's a very clever person, and they want to survive, they want to take their kids to school. And that can be an interesting thing when you're trying to shift mindsets. Are you looking at those designs of projects of research in their perspective? Are you looking at it from a global north perspective? So we are trying to do all this decolonial thinking and design. But for me, I think the biggest takeaway, and where I find that farmers are trying to negotiate, is just like what has been mentioned. Just a fair representation in those rooms. One of our outcomes under FFF is on policy negotiation. Actually, that is the first one, on those issues of climate. And you will find that there are competing interests, people wanting to pull to their sides of the scheme. But we are saying that with politics and with all these things, when people are organized together, they can be a force to be reckoned with. And the farmers are taking up themselves, organizing, agitating for change, and we are seeing it happening. It's incremental, it's small, it's baby steps, but we hope that the momentum can keep. On the other issue of the finance, we are telling them, yes, it's what you're doing is great, you're raising a lot of money in boxes, but can you start to show maybe how you document this? In Kenya, for example, those small groups and MasterCard did something on that. How can we start to show some, transactions, digital data records, issues like that, so that you start to challenge this narrative that these people cannot be able to pay back when they are loaned. They are really already self-organizing these village mechanisms. So just trying to show those small acts that work, and hopefully that this momentum can be picked and they can be bankable. And UN is already doing something in Ghana. We hope to collaborate with like-minded.
Thank you. Somebody online has pointed out, which is that most farmers in the world are actually women, so maybe we shouldn't refer to them as he. So just that's okay, that's all right. But actually, if Gertrude's still there, I wonder if Gertrude, you might be able to say anything about how you're organizing, if there is organizations across farmers in Zambia in the way that Stephen has been describing, and if that works in your lobbying with parliamentarians.
Thank you very much. Yes, we've been organizing farmers in a way that they need to speak as one voice and not to work in isolation, because we've come to realize that when farmers are put in groups, the voices becomes stronger. And also there is a lot of sharing of information which leads to change in the mindset. Currently, farmers are actually accusing us development promoters, which I agree. They are saying, we thought you were bringing something or the kind of farming methodologies that were going to make us independent. But instead, you are creating a lot of dependence in us, because previously we used to do or practice crop diversification in the same field, because each crop that was being planted had benefit to any other plant that is planted in the same field. For instance, you plant maize, then you bring in beans or the cover crop, which had a purpose to the maize that is growing. But now we are saying, no, you need to go this way. You need to grow a lot of maize because maize has got a lot of money, and because the kind of seed that is being promoted is very expensive. And it has caused a lot of farmers in the rural areas to start practicing monocropping, which is actually very dangerous, because of now we have a lot of changes in the weather pattern. 2023, 2024, we had a huge impact on droughts in the southern region of the country, of Africa, or of the continent. All those farmers that did not practice agroecology did not harvest not even a single grain. But those farmers that we've put in groups who are participating in farmer groups did practice agroecology, and they were able to harvest, even able to sell the surplus. The only thing that I've realized among us people who are promoting this kind of development in our rural areas, there is one area that we haven't really invested in. This is the research and the development. There's a lot that is going on among community members, among rural community farmers, which we can learn from, but we do not have documentation, which can be used as a tool to convince policymakers to accept that there is evidence out there that is happening, which we can easily use for us to change the policies, so that we can come up with policies that are working for rural communities, and not to come up with policies that we think will work, but meanwhile do not work.
Okay, thank you, Gertrude.
Another aspect.
Okay, quick.
Okay.
Go on.
Yeah, another aspect that we need to change, it is when we commit that we are going to work in line with agreements that are signed at international level, we need really to implement what we've agreed to do. For instance, a number of countries in Africa or worldwide have signed to the Paris Agreement, but however, the practice is completely different. Right now, we are scaling up the huge company or plant for electricity generation using coal, which is really contrary to what we signed for in the Paris Agreement. So what are we telling ourselves? We need to change our mindset so that we can save our Earth planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There was a question in post to the earlier session, which seemed to be more relevant to this one. It's from Brian Baldwin, if he's here somewhere. I don't know where we're at with microphones, but while he's getting prepared, maybe you could comment on something. Thank you.
Yeah, so on the trade-offs point, to pick up on some of Clive's introduction, I love the story about the leaf and the underlying causes and that kind of shift in perspective. Trade-offs are much discussed in the investment world, and the other room this week that you could be in is there's a pension investment conference in Edinburgh this week, and there's lots of people talking about how to invest pensions money, and they talk about trade-offs all the time, and there's trade-offs inherent in some of our decisions, but we've already encoded how we're going to decide those trade-offs to law. We've legalized it. So there's two big things that impact how we land when balancing the trade-offs. One, fiduciary duty. So when people are investing your pensions money on your behalf, they believe they have a fiduciary duty to maximize returns. So that makes make money at any cost, right? So if it means selling drugs to people who don't need them, or mining in countries with terrible labor practices, if it makes good money, they'll do it. Now, you as an individual might not make the same decision, but we've encoded that. They can have regard to the environment or social, but they cannot prioritize it. So profit is supreme above social and environmental, and that's encoded. So rather than litigating, just change that law, just that one. And then another one, companies are the same. Section 172 of the Corporations Act. Directors are obliged to maximize the profit of the corporation at the expense of planet and society. So we've literally encoded it. We have decided who wins in the battle of trade-offs, but we decided it. Humans wrote that law. So we want different outcomes. There's no point lobbying or chaining yourself to a tree. Go talk to the lawyer and change the system.
There might be some other lawyers in the room, Francesco. It's okay. Brian?
Yeah, thanks very much. Good morning, all. Brian Baldwin, originally from Peebles, but now based down in Rome, working in the UN agencies in those rooms that have been referred to earlier, and was just in a series of negotiations last week on FAO's new livestock policy. But I wanted just to touch on a couple of things and end up with a question, because my original question's been answered, discussed about 4 or 5 times in the discussion. I think Stephen started off really well talking about the priorities of smallholder farmers. School, health, employment and income. Those are the drivers. And the more that they are recognized by all financiers and by governments at national level, you will start to get the programs that can start to address climate adaptation. And that's only just beginning to happen. And with all due respect to Casey, that is returns on investment. As Stephen said, if smallholders have invested 380 billion, the word invest springs out. It means that the farmers are hoping for a return to provide education, health, income, and employment. So one can talk about profit, one can also talk about returns. And recently, the Minister of Livestock in Kenya said, he came to FAO last week and said, I need to see returns to my smallholder producers to produce more milk. That was the point there. We've talked about agroecology, and I spent 4 years in Zambia working with the British aid program and USAID. So Gertrude and Stephen, it's a real pleasure to hear you talk this morning. But again, the discussion about agroecology is very, very important. But what's been happening in the international arena is agroecology and other innovative approaches. And as Clive had said, that includes then regenerative agriculture, agroforestry. And I'd be interested from Gertrude to hear what other practices are being adopted by smallholders in Zambia.
I suggest people should be short in their.
Yes, exactly, right. It's the trade-offs, and that discussion is very nascent in the technology field, in the policy field, and in financial. And that really, and my question then to Stephen and others is, look, at national level, how do you unlock local finance? I'm not sure we're going to get that investment funds coming. How do you unlock the local finance? How do you increase ministry budgets, which at the moment, government budgets focused on education, health, and infrastructure. Agriculture is the Cinderella ministry. How can we increase those local budgets? How can you bring in local investment to finance what we've been discussing about? Apologies for being so long.
Thank you, Francesco. Before he leaves, asked a question about what we can do about our pension contributions.
It's already
It's already kind of been answered. Thank you very much. Yes, would you like to reply to Brian? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so, Brian, and for appreciating us and the work that we are doing. Indeed, the Forest and Farm Facility does not prescribe any one solution to the smallholders. We let them be the drivers of change. We design with them. And for Gertrude, on the issue of knowledge products, we co-generate products with those farmers, a lot of case studies. If you go to IID website, I think over 7,000 of them. But the question is that knowledge really getting to the farmers? So that, I think, for me, is the question. And on the issue, the last issue that I want to address, Brian, on in how do we unlock then national finance? It's a very interesting question. My colleague Isabella Nunes did a whole lot of project case studies based on what smallholders are doing, and they are really mobilizing billions of money. You know, some of these big cooperatives. I don't have the numbers top of my head. But one of the things that we are doing, and I think I alluded to it, is to help the farmers to transition from that savings in the box. Can they start to demonstrate that they really are making savings? Because for the banks, they want to see, you know, complex things like a business, you know, plan, issues like that. So we are trying to help them to see a business case is in investing with the farmers. Can they start to show the numbers through maybe digital filing instead of keeping a box? Can they start to improve the way they keep their records through issues like those toolkits that I showed there on Get Set tool? It's a tool that shows how do you do this, how do you improve credibility. And then when those numbers starts to pop up, then those investors, whether it's the local level, you know, cooperatives, they're also creating their own cooperatives, self-finance. But again, when they show that there is big money, and we know that banks want that they can bring in. We are working with examples like in Kamboaku in Ghana, and working with Ogis and some business here trying to reduce those transaction costs, because another excuse has been it's very difficult to lend to all these people here that are all over. How do you track them? Then we want to show them that when farmers are self-organized, it's easy then to lend to them, whether through their entry point. And FAO is actually trialing that mechanism. 2 weeks ago in Tanzania, Arusha, through the FFF, we launched a mechanism that we can give some seed money to the cooperatives so that they can loan their people, and then we'll be able to derive nice case study to show that these people are bankable and they can be able to pay back. Thank you.
So just another way of looking at that question, I think, and to add a third encoding to Casey's, is around property rights and the extent to which they're privately held and how they're administered in relation to public interests as well, including water, climate, carbon, and so on. And then I think that also links to question of risks in supply chains. So the task forces on financial and nature disclosures and climate disclosures and potentially are really effective ways to hold corporations to account in terms of the distribution of risk associated with their activities. So a lot of what happens on farms is dependent on who's prepared to pay for what over the farm gate, and that thereby shapes what gets done on that farm. And if, as a result of that, large corporations take all the profit and pass all the risk on to the farmer, arguably that's not very fair. But so I think those mechanisms are really important in terms of a question. One question is about how you unlock investment. The other question is about how you unlock responsibility.
Thank you. Sorry, 1 second. I have two interesting questions about finance. And one is Anne in the room. Someone's got a mic, but not for a minute. And one is from Zipporah Chalwa, who's I'm thinking might be online. Is there a way that we could bring her in? Okay, so we'll let Casey make her point, and then we'll bring Zipporah in, and then we'll come to Anne. Okay, thank you.
Can't remember. No, that's okay. So there's something called the Danish Fund. I don't know if you know about it. So the Danish Fund provides a guarantee to local banks so that they can reduce the interest rate to farmers, which I think is interesting as long as they don't charge too much of a guarantee. So a helpful use of capital there. I can't remember what else I was going to say, so let's do the question.
All right, thank you. Zipporah, if you want to unmute your mic, you can go ahead.
Answer that one.
I will ask.
Yes, yes,
Go on.
yes,
Go
sure,
on.
I'm here. Thank you for the opportunity, and I really love the conversation around climate justice. So my question is on the investment part. Okay, having listened to the conversation regarding farmers having limited access to funds. And from my experience, I have interacted with these smallholder farmers, and their major issue is access actually to funding, which can help them scale up their conservation activities. So maybe if one of you can just help us understand, like which mechanisms can be put in place just to ensure that more trust is gained, and some of these issues can be solved. So if maybe there are maybe reliable mechanisms or what has worked somewhere else that some of us here can listen to and maybe implement in our various interactions with the local communities. So that is my question. Thank you.
That's a really, really good, difficult question that I don't know how to answer. But I'm going to try and tell you what I know, which is why it doesn't work, and then bring and then we could maybe give some examples of where it has. So one of the reasons why it's so hard to take big institutional investment money and get it to places where the people using it are going to use small amounts of money and they're highly dispersed. The analogy I like to use is imagine an electricity pylon, right? They're really huge. That's the institutional investor. Imagine the project that you want to fund. It's a farm. We're doing regenerative practices. That is a hairdryer. Try and plug the hairdryer into the pylon. It doesn't work. So that's one of the problems. There is not the right wiring and the voltage is too high in financial terms. And that's why what we see emerging is ways. So I guess if you were an electrician, you'd say a transformer, right? A transformer to allow the hairdryer to plug in. So whether that's providing a guarantee to a local bank or creating blended finance. What we have found is if you try and take us and make us design what works over there, it doesn't work because we don't have the expertise, and we try and do things like sell you seeds that you don't need and maximize profit. So it has to be people, place, and community led is what I would say. Bridge for you. And you've got an answer.
It's a very difficult one. I don't have an answer, Zipporah Charwa, and thank you for that wonderful question. I think for me, I'll still go back to what I had mentioned before, that there is a lot of mistrust between these financials, or something is just getting lost. Because tell me why we have billions committed and it's not getting down. And I've given you the numbers. It's very shameful. Partly 1% of all the commitment is getting to the ground. And there are so many reasons, transactions, just so I want to challenge you all in the room, and Zipporah, when you get an opportunity, read a publication by my colleague Isabella Nunes. It's called Mobilizing Internal Finance. And that book there are case studies. She did a credible job of looking at how some of these groups are doing. And an example from Kenya, for example, some of those groups, when they form from village savings mechanisms, then they get nice cooperatives working. If you look at the dairy sector in Kenya, it will start to give you issues, how they evolve. And the cooperatives are big. They even form banks of their own. So for us and for IID, and what we are trying to do is to encourage these farmers to self-mobilize their own finances. And then somewhere along the way, if we need to brand finance, they have found the train has already left the scene. So we are looking inwards for us first, and then maybe, like what I mentioned, externally, we are trying to demonstrate that indeed these farmers can be trusted. You make business case to work with them, and for those interested to partner with us, then we'll meet at the middle somewhere as equal partners and make it work. And you can look at what happened last week in FAO. I don't have the case study now because we just launched that facility. We are trying to advance a little bit of grant money into a cooperative. They were in Arusha, and they work with a lot of farmers. Then they can advance a little bit of seed money into all those kind of small businesses that they're doing. And when that is paid up, we'll bring back the lessons, and hopefully next year when we have a conference like this, I'll be able to share a little bit of what has happened on the ground and demonstrate that these farmers really, they're mobilizing a lot of money. I quoted the number 616 billion and other big monies. But I challenge you to look at that publication, Mobilizing Internal Finance by Isabella Nunes of IID. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, we're running out of time a little bit. Can we agree that we might share it? We can share it with participants, share a link with participants so everybody has some access to it if it's accessible. Thank you. We'll just let Anne, she can make her question a bit briefer, and then we'll please, thank you.
So you may have answered some of this already. So how much capital from pensions in Scotland could be conceivably tasked to help fund the just transition here? And it's maybe a question, is there some sort of financial instrument that could be crafted to help smallholder farmers elsewhere? Is there like a bond, or is there other types of kind of products that pension firms and others could conceive of? And can we do that in a Scottish context?
In 1 minute.
In 1 minute. I can't remember how much money is in Scotland. However, I did contribute to a report which has the number. So there, I will give them to you. There is an ABI, that's the Association of British Insurers, Climate Change Roadmap. We looked at how much money there is, what's needed for a transition, where the gap is, and how we can deploy it. That then led into the Mansion House Agreement with Treasury, where we said we would invest in productive finance in the UK economy, and the group of 20 who are all deciding what industry is going to shape. So stuff is happening. In Scotland, the Green Finance Institute and Transition Finance Scotland are working on hybrid investment vehicles to enable pension scheme investors to invest, because not only are we like an electricity pylon, we only allow certain hairdryers because there's weird rules. So we're trying to change some of the rules. So more hairdryers. This is a terrible analogy that more hairdryers are allowed to be plugged in. What's the last question? The Ghana piece and farmers. There is some stuff on the Green Finance Institute website on the last page of the thing that I said, transactions to transitions. They're looking at different vehicles. What I would say though is there's a massive cognitive dissonance happening here, even when we're talking about this, the fact that we don't trust farmers, and yet we've given trillions to people who are running AI companies. What are we doing? That financiers don't trust farmers when they destroyed the global economy. I mean, there's a real cognitive dissonance. What's going on? So there's that sitting underneath all of it. Question mark.
Thank you. way to finish, but Clive wants to have a last word. So
Because we get asked a very similar question in terms of how much will it cost to fix nature, and whatever you scale you look at that from national to global, it's about 1% of whatever GDP is at that scale. And so then the question for me is, are you really saying that if 99% of the money in the economy isn't really doing any problem? So I think the question is more about how do you mainstream everything that we're talking about in everything that we do across society.
Sorry, one last thing. Sorry, I promise. One last thing. And I think there was a nature report. I don't know if it was from Nature Scotland, but it might have been. So we do all these reports on sustainable finance, and we try and talk about how much money is sustainable. And we spend too much time doing that. And the Nature report came out, and he said, yeah, some of this money is good for nature, but like 85% of it is destroying nature. And so changing the framing of the conversation. Around not how do we redeploy finance to solve problems, but how do we stop financing problems?
Thank you. And please thank the panel altogether. Thank you. Before I say something about the workshops, which you're now all going to rush off to, I just wanted to draw your attention to the QR code on your table. Our Global Citizenship Education Committee published an open letter to the leaders of Scotland's political parties, asking them to make global citizenship education a key part of their manifestos. Please scan it, and if you can sign it, we'd like some more sign-ons if possible. And one great pleasure, I'm going to invite Maya, who I've lost. She's here, Maya, who's just going to give us a quick announcement from the diaspora. Thank you.
Anyone who knows me, 2 minutes is not enough. So I've had to write down what I want to say. So my name is Maya, and I'm the founder of the African, Caribbean, Asian and Mixed Heritage Association. And I'm also the national chair of the Diaspora Group for Global Citizenship. And Neil Gopal is the Global Justice Chair for the Diaspora Global Citizenship, and he's also the Deputy Director of the West of Scotland Regional Equalities Council. A mouthful. The Diaspora Group for Global Citizenship is made up of community leaders representing their local communities all around Scotland. Our mission is to champion for racial justice, for a fairer Scotland and a fairer world. We do this by advocating for diaspora communities in Scotland policy, influencing decision on racial justice, education and international development. We support Scotland global, I've written it down so quickly. We support Scotland global development sector to adopt fair and decolonial approaches and promote diaspora and majority world-led action for global justice. We promote global citizenship, racial justice, and cultural understanding to access communities in Scotland. Meaningful, authentic impact cannot happen without the impact and input of the diaspora communities in Scotland. The Diaspora Group for Global Citizenship will be opening its membership soon. If you're serious, and I'm going to use the word serious, if you're serious about global justice, if you're serious about global change and maximizing community participation, you can come and speak to us. And the reason I'm saying that is you hear people who are interested, they want to know something, but it stops, the conversation stops when the conference ends, and it can't be like that. We need people who want to really participate and have an input. We don't want 20% input after a project has started. We want participation from the beginning. Let us be part of the conversations. So we have our stand by the lobby. Scan, come and ask questions. I'm just going to get some of the diaspora members just to stand up and just give everyone a wave. Let us know who you are. We've got Kingsley's here. We've got our secretary there. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Maya. So we're going to move to workshops now, and I'm hoping everybody signed up, although I forgot to remind you to do so in the last break. So if you haven't signed up, I guess you can probably still join one. Just to let you know, those online should stay where they are, they shouldn't move, and that they will join the workshop that will be in this room, which is workshop 2, Meaningful Participation, Inclusion and Localization, which is going to be run by SCIAF and CBM. Thank you. Workshops 1 and 3 are on the first floor. So we'll get everybody just after this to go up to the first floor. Workshop 1 on transformation through locally led development with Sarah Hand will be in the Burns Suite, which is on the right-hand side as you go up on the first floor. Just looking down this way. And Workshop 3, mobilizing for change, advocacy and accountability in a time of cuts and crisis with our colleagues from Bond, will be in the Scott Suite, which is on the left side. So are you following me? Right, I'm going to repeat that. Workshop 2 is in here. Workshop 1 and 3 are upstairs. Thank you. I hope that's clear. And we'll see you back down for lunch at 1:30. Thank you very much.
I won't be here for long, but let's swap details.
Not long away, though, is it?
I'm over. Oh, you see that? I'll let go. You sound like. Yeah, that's probably it. Yeah, they sound like.
Hand a look at Basically, I can.
So you mentioned.
I'm gonna say I use the link.
Thank you. You didn't jump on hard.
What a shit. Thank you. I did you. Thank you so much. So we have the right Another deal with the mate situation.
That was happy.
Thanks, wonderful.
Yeah.
No, I know, we're all. I usually like. So we're having. Very good. I've got a call out ticket plan. So they have come back.
I think I have to go to.
I don't know. I mean, I can pump everyone. Yes.
I guess, well, I wanted some of this.
And I'm moving up your way.
Well, that's because obviously, like, that's an election.
So we are in the fortunate position that everyone online they've been forced to join this workshop. So welcome everyone online and welcome to everyone in the room who had a choice. So we appreciate you joining us here today. So this workshop is a collaboration between SCIAF, and that's Jonathan, and myself, I'm Lena. So we will be talking a little bit about localization from SCIAF's perspective. And then we have our wonderful colleagues from CBM, Alfreda and Mark. And they will also be, of course, like bringing their perspectives on localization and inclusion to this conversation today. So the plan for the next hour is that we are gonna each take 10 minutes or so to talk through some points. Well, 10 minutes, 10 minutes. So after half an hour, we're going to break out in some breakout groups. There'll be 2 online, and we will join you online, 2 of us, to facilitate those discussions. And then Mark and Jonathan will help facilitate the second here. So we will have about 20 minutes to discuss a few questions in these groups. And we will kind of close with a bit of a reflection on what we have learned, what we are taking away from the session today. So I hope that all gets great. I should have let you see this slide. Good. So I am first going to kind of frame the whole conversation for us. And I'm going to be doing that with inspiration from a report that came out from the Caritas Network just a week ago. So I am going to be very much taking care of the kind of theoretical part of like, what are we talking about when we talk about localization? And some of you might be very, very aware of what that term means and how we are using that. But just rest assured, we're going to get more interesting perspectives when I hand over to Jonathan and CBM to talk about how we actually do localization with our partners. So let's get the boring bits out of the way. Localization is something that we have been speaking about in our industry for about 10 years. And I guess the popularity of localization has gone a little bit up and down, but there is a consensus about that this is something that is really effective, that puts people at the heart of action, and something that we really haven't gone to its full potential. When we talk about localization, there is a tendency to frame it in terms of cost effectiveness, that it's basically a good way to get more bang for your buck and to react a little bit faster than we can if we are flying ourselves out to villages to hand out help. But we have increasingly also started discussing that it is not just about funding flows, it is about power, and it's about kind of fundamentally about respect and meaningful participation. And in that way, localization is really trying to address some structural inequalities that are embedded in the humanitarian system. And in that way, we have to recognize that when we don't do localization very well, it is not the system failing, it's the system working how it was set up. So with a focus on localization, we're trying to fix a problem that is inherently part of the system. And that is why localization becomes, and here at my attempt, or not my attempt, but my colleagues in Caritas attempt at a definition, localization becomes a transformative and bold approach, underpinned by equity, accountability, and local leadership, one in which power, resources, and decision-making is shared, grounded in trust and solidarity, which then leads us to that humanitarian action is shaped by local actors, their knowledge, their priorities, and their capacities. So the report I keep talking about is this report that you see referenced here. This is coming from the Caritas Network. So SCIAF is the well, Caritas Scotland, and we're part of the Caritas Federation. And the Federation is very interested in partnership as kind of a pillar in everything we do. And this is the second report on locally led humanitarian action. And it is trying to highlight the gap that we've heard a little bit about in some of the other presentations here today, the gap between what we say we want and what we end up doing. So they've interviewed and surveyed UN agencies, governments, and local actors and asked, how well are we doing localization? And it turns out there are things that are working and also things that are not really happening that we say we want. So this is taken directly from the report. They found that local actors are increasingly taking on more